Hi, good evening, everyone. Right. The topic of discussion today is quite interesting. What we have seen over the last few classes is in terms of how the entirety of the original proceeding has actually transpired right from the day when you meet the client all the way up to having addressed the oral arguments. Now, effectively, once you have addressed oral submissions, the judge concerned will either dictate the order then and there in court and decide your fate, or, as is the case usually in more complex matters, he or she will reserve the matter for formal pronouncement of orders. Now, once this happens, subsequently, on a given date, the judge concerned will render his or her verdict in the form of a judgment, which will then adjudicate on the rights and entitlements of the parties concerned. Now, once this happens, you then have in front of you a final decision which you then need to reckon with. Now, let's say you did like the best possible. You thought you had a wonderful oral submission. The judge seemed to be inclined, judge seemed to be in your favor, but then ultimately at the end of the day you get a judgment completely against you, rejecting almost all your submissions, and obviously that's pretty much game over. So now what do you do? This is where essentially we will start off from today, and we will look at avenues, or we will look at the way forward once the original proceeding, whether it be a civil suit, whether it be a writ petition, a miscellaneous application, any honor of litigation, once the original proceeding is over and you get a verdict in your favor or you get a verdict against you, what is the way forward? Now, if the verdict is in your favor, the answer is relatively simple. You can either try and execute the judgment of the decree, which is something we will look at in the next session on Sunday. And if there is an avenue of a further challenge to that judgment or decree to the other side, then you may file a caveat with that appropriate appellate forum, just to ensure that as and when the appellate proceedings do take place, you are given prior notice. So if it's in your favor, well, you don't really have a lot to worry about in terms of what to do in the future, except for waiting for the appeal and obviously defending whatever you have secured in the appellate or revisional court. But today we are more concerned with what if you lose. And this is to try and examine the kind of avenues available to a litigant and what a lawyer needs to bear in mind when faced with an adverse verdict. So essentially, I'll be dealing with four subsets today, four fundamental issues. One, we will be dealing with the possibility or the avenues available for appeals or revisions. Number two, we will look at the possibility of a review application before the same judge or court or tribunal which rendered the judgment in the first place. Number three, we will briefly examine statute specific avenues for attempting to reverse what is the finding of the original forum. And lastly, we will look at constitutional avenues for seeking redress against orders or let's say any particular adjudication which is against you. Now, please bear in mind when we talk about appeals or revisions or any form of challenge procedure here, I will also be dealing with situations wherein you may have suffered an adverse finding qua any of the interim applications that you may have filed. Now, please bear in mind when we talked about, let's say, the journey of the suit, we had at one point discussed the different kinds of interim applications which may possibly be filed during the course of a particular suit or proceeding, seeking a wide litany of interim relief, such as stays, injunctions, seeking rejection of the proceedings at an initial stage, etc., etc. So, when we talk about appeals and revisions, we will not only be talking about appeals and revisions or reviews from the perspective of a final decree or a judgment, but also from the perspective of what is the potential for challenge if one of your interim applications gets rejected. So, with that particular element in mind, first let us start out with the essential aspects of an appeal as also a revision. Now, see, ultimately, the most straightforward way of dealing with a particular decree or a final judgment which has gone against you is to file an appeal. Now, contrary to popular perception, an appeal is not an inherent right. Please bear in mind, in our judicial system, an appeal is purely a creation of a statute. So when we talk about appeal simpliciter, do not presume that every adverse finding against you will necessarily be reviewed by an appellate forum at the mere asking. That is not the case. You need to be able to establish that the appeal which you are filing is something which has been specifically provided to you under an applicable statute. So therefore, if it is a case under the CPC, you look at this section or the order in the CPC which permits appeals. And if that particular section, or if the judgment or decree which you've suffered, or the order, the interim order which you've suffered, is actually an appealable order, then please go ahead and by all means file an appeal. But if it does not fall within that ambit, then please remember, an appeal is always a creation of a statute, not something you get as a matter of right. This is also the same position which exists as far as a revision is concerned. Now, this is a good overview which I had found. I couldn't upload this, I didn't find it in time. In terms of the overall parameters of an appeal and a revision, and the nuances in terms of the differentiation between them at certain levels. So, to quickly run through this, please note, as I already mentioned to you, that an appeal is something whereby you are then given the opportunity to move a higher forum and ask for a relook or ask for a de novo adjudication, purely in the sense of what is the ultimate finding in the order of the original forum. So please bear in mind, under our legal system, when you go in appeal, an appeal does not mean that the entirety of the process is repeated. An appeal is confined, except for certain very limited exceptions which you will come to, is confined to a re-argument on what is the existing record before the original court. So in the simplest of terms, in an appeal, you re-argue what has essentially transpired before the lower court or the original court, and try and convince the appellate court to take a different view on the basis of the record already generated before the first court. Now, depending on the kind of scope which is available to you, in a first appeal, you may essentially be able to argue both on questions of fact as well as questions of law. Now, under the CPC, the word appeal, even though not specifically defined, has always been construed to be a very wide provision in the sense of the jurisdiction that it confers upon the appellate court. So therefore, the appellate court is entitled to not only re-examine questions of fact, but it is also entitled to re-examine questions of law. So for instance, in our typical example of the contract between A and B, in an appellate forum, let's say A succeeds, A is able to prove that there was a contract between him and B. B is entitled to re-argue the point, if at all factually a contract could have been said to have come into existence, as also be is allowed to re-argue questions of law. Does that particular factual determination actually fit into the applicable law under the Contract Act, thereby justifying the finding of the trial court that, or the original court, that there was indeed a contract between the parties. So therefore, when we talk about appeal simpliciter, an appeal is usually very widely worded. Now, always bear in mind before we move on to the next aspect, an appeal can actually occur in two instances when you look at it from the perspective of the institutional paradigm. One, an appeal may be an inter-court appeal. This will arise in cases, for instance, if you again take an example under the CPC, for instance, in states where we had mentioned in the beginning, there are many states, the majority of states, where the high courts don't have original jurisdiction. So let's say a suit was filed before the district judge. Now, under the CPC, from the determination of the district judge, a regular first appeal will lie to the high court. Now, this is a inter-court appeal because ultimately you are moving from the trial court to the high court, which is a distinct forum. As opposed to this, you may have an intra-court appeal. For instance, a particular suit is valued so low that it goes to the very first civil court. It goes to a civil judge, and under the pecuniary jurisdiction of that particular state, the appeal against that decree lies to the district judge. So therefore, you may have within the district court an inter-court appeal, an intra-court appeal within the meaning of appeal under the CPC. Similarly, if a high court has original jurisdiction, then the decree or judgment passed by the single bench is then appealable before the division bench of that high court, which would effectively hear the regular first appeal. So therefore, within the high court also, there can be this intra-court appeal. So depending on where your suit is filed, depending on the kind of jurisdiction exercised by the courts of the particular territory, etc., you may either be faced with a intra-court appeal or an inter-court appeal. But aside from the fact that these emanate between different forums, insofar as the scope is concerned, in terms of re-examining questions of fact and re-examining questions of law, there is no significant change. Now, to move further, if we have to talk about appeal, as I already mentioned to you, appeal is purely a creation of a statute. Of course, it's a substantive right. It's not a procedural right. It is a substantive right in itself, but it is a right which is curated or constrained by the wordings of the particular statute. So therefore, if that particular statute, let's say the CPC, only provides for appeals against a particular order or the decree, see, a final judgment or decree, provided it is actually something which is prejudicial to you, is by in almost all circumstances appealable in some form. But particularly when it comes to interim orders, filing appeals is something which is not something which is guaranteed at all. Even in terms of final decrees, please note there are exceptions. For instance, if there is a final decree based on consent, let's say A and B consent, compromise before the original forum, and based on their consent, the original forum decrees that particular suit. Against a consent decree, no appeal lies. Though, of course, there are other avenues, you may move a review or something saying there was fraud. There are specific provisions under the CPC dealing with this, saying that the consent was not obtained in a proper manner, etc. But that's a matter for different discussion. So when it comes to appeals or when it comes to any form of challenge, these are constrained by the statute. Now, we've talked about the CPC so far, but again, jumping ahead a bit and coming to a specific statute, please have a look at Section 37 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. So Section 37 specifically curates the kind of orders which are appealable under the Arbitration Act. Orders which do not fall within that particular limited category, therefore, are not appealable. And you will find a lot of Supreme Court judgments saying that since the Arbitration Act is a complete code in itself, much like the CPC is also a complete code in itself for matters within its jurisdiction, appeals are simply not maintainable if they are not provided for within that particular provision. Now, obviously, an appeal is something which is personal to the party concerned. Therefore, if the party passes away, then naturally the appeal abates, unless, of course, the legal representatives are brought on record. This is very much the same case in the case of a suit or original proceeding also. God forbid, if a litigant passes away during the proceedings, then you are required to bring the legal representatives on record if you wish to continue with that particular suit or defense, whatever the case might be. Now, please bear in mind, there is no concept of a suo motu appeal. No appellate forum can suo motu call up a case and say, oh, we want to hear the appeal in this. Obviously, an appeal has to be articulated by a party concerned who has actually suffered some prejudice as a result of that determination. Now, please remember one important aspect, that an appeal is essentially a continuation of the original proceeding, at least in terms of the CPC, because as I mentioned, the scope for the appellate court to relook or re-examine is extremely wide. Now, the only one more important aspect which you need to keep in mind is you will come across this concept called merger, the doctrine of merger. So please remember, once an appellate forum decides the first appeal, the decree or judgment of the original forum is then deemed to have merged with the order of the appellate court. So therefore, whatever way the appellate court goes, the appellate court may completely uphold the original order. The appellate court may vary the order to a certain extent, modify it, or the appellate court may set aside the order in toto. So whatever happens in the appellate forum, please bear in mind, when it comes to what are the rights of the parties, and later we will see that when we come in execution also, the rights are determined purely by the appellate judgment. And therefore, once the appellate judgment is passed, in legal parlance, the judgment of the original forum to that effect is effaced. And it is the appellate judgment alone which determines the rights and liabilities of the parties. Now, naturally, if an event is subsequent to, say, the judgment passed by the trial court or by the original forum, naturally, you are permitted to bring any subsequent events which may be of relevance or may be material to the attention of the appellate forum. Now, as I already mentioned to you, this judgment also of the Supreme Court clarifies that there is no inherent right of appeal. It is purely a creation of the statute. Whereas in the case of, say, in the case of a civil remedy, since the courts are obviously sovereign instruments, you have a right to articulate a grievance on merits before any court. Now, it's a different issue if your suit will get knocked out or rejected because of, say, a legal infirmity, because of being time barred, etc., etc. But you have a right. You have a right to walk into any court and file a litigation and have it examined at least on the first blush by the competent court, subject to issues of maintainability. But for an appeal, you can't even begin to postulate the possibility of an appeal till there is an express right given to you in this regard by the particular statute or whatever might be the relevant rules or regulations which govern that particular litigation. Now, something very similar in the sense that the remaining slides in terms of the judgments you can go through in detail. And this is important in the judgment in Banarasi versus Ramphal, that there are obviously certain limitations in terms of what is the power in the appellate forum. One of which is that even the person, let's say, who succeeds in a litigation, now, for instance, A and B are fighting. Now, A's suit is decreed against B to a certain extent. A claimed 4 reliefs, but A was awarded only 3 reliefs. So effectively, A is happy because the majority of the reliefs got awarded. B is completely dissatisfied because those are major reliefs. B goes in appeal, saying these 3 reliefs should not have been granted. Now, if A wants to articulate an objection as to why his fourth relief was rejected by the original forum, he can't utilize the appeal filed by B to say, oh, by the way, even I am aggrieved by the rejection of my last claim. Please hear me on that. He cannot say so. So, therefore, whatever might be the limited grievance against an order, also, A is required to file an individual appeal or a cross objection, which is specifically permitted under the CPC, in the appeal filed by the counterparty. Now, also remember that there is a rule, of course, Rule 33, Order 41, where there is some sort of an inherent power with the court to vary or modify the decree of the lower court. But this power cannot be exercised to the prejudice of any party which is not before the court. Also, it cannot result in the revival of a claim which was otherwise given up. And if, as I already mentioned to you, if that party specifically had a right of appeal, like A in that case, and did not take it up, then obviously this discretion, which is otherwise provided by the CPC to an appellate forum, cannot be exercised. Now, one essential element, which one has to understand is that the appeal which is provided for under the CPC is extremely wide. But please bear in mind, the scope of appeal can vary depending on the situation or the circumstances. For example, as I mentioned to you, that under some specific statutes, special statutes, the right of appeal may not be that broad because of the wording of the statute or because of the interpretation of that particular appellate remedy by the courts concerned in their judgments. But under the CPC, the thumb rule is that the appeal which is actually provided is very, very wide in nature. Now, also in the sense that the appellate court, of course, has the full power to actually have a relook at the facts and actually arrive at its own findings. Now, the reason I'm stressing on this so much is that aside from these CPC appeals or aside from stricto sensu appeals, in the vast majority of other, let's say, remedies which are available to a party, challenge remedies, if I may call it that, the scope is far narrower, as we will come when we come to the subsequent provisions such as revisions, reviews, etc. So in an appeal, it's one of the rare challenge mechanisms where you are essentially entitled to a hearing of both the factual as also legal merits of the controversy. Now, one aspect which one must bear in mind is that ultimately the appellate court also is required, because the scope is so wide, to take into account each and every submission which is being urged by the party concerned. So to that effect, it is not open to an appellate forum to say this submission does not fall within my scope in the sense of my power. Whatever is the record, whatever are the arguments before the original forum, you are entitled to have a relook at the appellate stage. Now, one element also further which you need to be aware of is that limited scope which I had mentioned to you in the beginning with regard to possible additional evidence before the appellate forum. Now, as a thumb rule, you cannot lead fresh evidence before the appellate forum. And there is a very sound public policy rationale behind this. Naturally, whatever is the evidence which is available, a party is duty bound to produce at the original stage before a court or forum which is actually trying the matter in the first instance. Because otherwise, it is very easy for parties to hold back, let's say, relevant evidence and then try and take a chance in subsequent proceedings in appeal, etc. Once it has lost the gambit and once it is aware of what tide exactly or where exactly the tide has turned. So therefore, there is a strong public policy rationale behind not permitting additional evidence in appellate court. But there are some very limited exceptions. So if you are ever in trouble in the sense that you discover that there is some evidence the client didn't tell you about, or some very material document which will have a huge bearing in the appeal and possibly significantly strengthen your case, you can try and utilize Order 41, Rule 27 of the CPC in a very limited instance to try and get this on record before the appellate court. Now, there are, of course, very stringent requirements. One, you must be able to establish that this document, let's say this evidence, was wrongly disallowed by the original court. For instance, as I had mentioned, after admission denial, you are required to prove documents. Only then they are exhibited. Let's say the trial court wrongly refuses to exhibit a particular document on the record. Then, of course, you can try and convince an appellate court to the contrary. Otherwise, if this is not a case of wrongful denial of admission of a relevant document, then you need to be able to convince the appellate court that the document which you are now seeking to refer to was not within your knowledge and that the same could not be produced despite due diligence. Now, the usage of the word due diligence is important because otherwise it's very easy for a party to come and say, oh, I didn't know about this document. Oh, I wasn't aware. Now I have come to be aware. So it's not a question of your ignorance. It's a question of whether a reasonable person, a reasonable litigant with reasonable due diligence should have been aware of that document or not. So to give you an example, in that litigation between A and B, if B now says, oh, by the way, I completely forgot, there was a letter written by A to me after the meeting admitting the fact that the contract as it stood on that date, or the draft contract as it stood on that day, was not agreeable to me, and therefore asking me for a further period of 2 weeks to be able to come back with a revised draft, which we could then agree on. Now, obviously, this is a smoking gun because this will completely overturn the finding of the original court, which essentially held that there was a contract between the parties. But this is a letter which naturally be in regular due diligence would have known was required to be produced before the original forum. And if deliberately or if for whatever reason that was not done, then the due diligence parameter may not be met and the request to produce the document now may be refused. Now, of course, this does not take away from the inherent right of the appellate court to require any document to be produced or witness to be examined to enable it to pronounce judgment. But this is again through a litany of case law. This has also been read down and it has been held that this is not a provision which can be used liberally or nor a provision which can be used to assist any of the parties in order to be able to succeed in their individual claims. This has squarely been held to apply only to the court's ability to be able to rule on a particular point, and that if it is completely unable to rule on a point without that particular document, only then recourse must be taken to this. So to go back to A and B, the absence of that letter does not disable the court from deciding. The absence of that letter only means that B loses. So therefore, this provision will not then really come into play. So I'm just trying to point out to you that the avenue is very, very limited. But if you are able to pitch your case within these narrow parameters, then possibly you will be able to get an appeal even under these circumstances where the documentary evidence was not produced by you. Now, this is the additional evidence paradigm, and this is obviously a discretion which is significantly circumscribed and not something to be utilized at the mere asking. Now, these are of course, the elaborations in terms of what exactly this particular jurisdiction means and how exactly this has been construed by the different courts. Now, see, another aspect which you also need to be aware of, that when you file an appeal, you need to be very, very clear about the fact that all appeals are subject to some form of limitation. Just like when we spoke about whether the claims were within limitation in one of the first interactions with our client before we started drafting, we are also need to be aware that once the original proceedings are over, there is a specified timeline for you to be able to articulate an appeal to the appellate forum. So in the case of a CPC, if it is a inter-court appeal, then the standard timeline is 90 days. Depending on the high court you are in, a intra-court appeal may essentially, you in usual circumstances, it's 30 days. Now, under the Commercial Courts Act, for matters falling within its jurisdiction, it is 60 days. So that varies. But please keep in mind the element of limitation whenever you deal with an appeal itself. Now, of course, there is a slight difference in the case of, let's say, if there is an ex parte order. Now, we talked about the suit in the entirety, wherein the defendant was represented at all stages. But there might be cases where the defendant simply fails to appear or deliberately does not appear, and a decree is passed against him or her ex parte. Now, when an ex parte decree is passed, there is a provision provided under the CPC for you to seek specific recall of that order under Order 9, Rule 13. So ultimately, you have the choice to either file an appeal or to file the Order 9, Rule 13. And in fact, the Supreme Court in one judgment says that there can be a certain simultaneous utilization of both of these mechanisms. Again, like I said, these are purely creations of the statute, and the statute determines what are the remedies which are available to you. Now, another aspect which which I had mentioned was that, see, when you talk about an appeal, you need to bear in mind two other aspects. One, under the CPC, appeals also require an independent court fee. This is under the CPC. So that is something you need to bear in mind. More importantly, when you file an appeal, always bear in mind that now if you are the unsuccessful party before the original forum, there is now an order or a decree against you. Now, ultimately, that is an order or a decree which is amenable to execution by the other side, seeking your compliance with what the judgment or decree has said. Now, in such a situation, once you file an appeal, obviously the appeal also will take its own sweet time in getting adjudicated upon, even if you are able to convince an appellate forum to issue notice. And of course, under the CPC, the appellate provisions are usually ones whereby you are almost guaranteed a notice, because statutorily the court is required to consider it. It's a matter of right. So the other side will be issued notice, they will turn up, then the matter will be fixed for hearing. So there will be a long time period. But in the interregnum, we've already suffered a decree. The decree may be for payment of money, decree may be for restitution of certain property, etc., etc. So in an appeal, you will invariably be required to make an application for stay. Now, always remember, no matter how good your case, an appellate court has the right to put you to terms before permitting you to address on the merits if you've made an application for stay. So what I mean by this is, let's say B suffers a decree, sum total of 1 crore rupees against A manages to get a decree and B suffers a decree of 1 crore rupees. B goes in appeal. Now B seeks stay of the judgment of the original court or trial court, because obviously A will otherwise try and execute it in the meantime. Now the appellate forum is specifically empowered, in fact is required to examine the relative merits of the appeal filed by B. And if B is pressing for a stay, require it to make a pre-deposit as a condition of stay. Now this pre-deposit, there is no specific, let's say, benchmark, whether it should be 25%, 50%, 100%. It can be any of this, and this falls within the discretion of the appellate forum. Please bear in mind, the deposit which you are making is before the court. You're not paying it out to the other side. But this is again something you need to be aware of, because if you are not willing to make that pre-deposit, or your client is not able to cough up the pre-deposit, the appellate court can refuse to grant you stay. Now, this is not a precondition to hearing you. On the merits, you can insist on being heard. But the appellate court has a discretion to say, if you don't pre-deposit this, we are not going to grant a stay of the execution. Then, the appeal will continue. And of course, later on, the consequences will follow, depending on whether you succeed in the appeal or not. So when it comes to an appeal, these are the important elements you need to bear in mind, in terms of, aside from the onus on the lawyer in terms of the facts or the law or convincing the appellate forum, the client also would have to take certain steps, say payment of court fee, possibly the willingness to make a pre-deposit, etc., before anything substantial can before basically you can even think about succeeding in the appellate stage. Now, this is as far as appeals are concerned. Now, what about revisions? Now, see, certain orders will not be expressly appealable because under the CPC, the paradigm is an appeal is a very wide remedy. So, consciously, there will be certain orders, there will be certain, let's say, adjudications, which the CPC or the relevant statute will determine not to be appealable. But there will still be a small gap available in terms of trying to postulate revisionary jurisdiction. Now, revisionary jurisdiction under the CPC or for any other statute, once again, is something which is a creation of the particular statute. So, under the CPC, you have the right to make a revisional, let's say, avenue before the High Court concerned from any order which may be passed by a court subordinate to the High Court, provided that the subordinate court's order meets the requirements under subsections A, B, and C. So therefore, as you see, these are obviously narrower than appeal itself, because here, if you see, primarily the revisional jurisdiction is concerned with jurisdictional issues or patent or gross illegalities. Now, please note the slightly nuanced but important distinction at this very stage between an appeal and a revisional jurisdiction. An appeal is extremely wide. You are entitled to call into question almost everything under the sun in terms of what was the original material before the trial court. But in a revisional jurisdiction, once you see the kind of terminology which is employed in the section, it is quite clear that you need to meet a much higher benchmark for the concerned High Court to interfere with an order passed by the subordinate court. Because as you will see, the kind of avenues which are available are not really factual in nature. The factual averments will only come in if you are able to demonstrate some really striking or gross material irregularity. Otherwise, everything else pertains purely to law, and that too in the sense of jurisdiction, something which goes to the root of the matter as far as the litigation is concerned. Now, one more issue which you need to understand where the revisional jurisdiction is concerned is that there are again certain other fetters on the High Court. For instance, if the order, if allowed to stand, would occasion a failure of justice or cause irreparable injury to the party against whom it was made, etc., etc., etc. So, one issue which essentially will come in a lot of these revision petitions is that you will have to contend with a lot of precedent where the courts concerned would have decided or will have taken the view that the revisional jurisdiction is much limited as compared to the appellate jurisdiction. Now, some of these judgments are mentioned in this particular PowerPoint because, as I mentioned to you, ultimately this section is not intended as a replacement or a parallel appellate process. So, as it is the case with interpretation of statutes or even contracts, if a particular instrument, in this case a statute, specifically provides for two distinct remedies, then ultimately there obviously cannot be an interpretation placed upon these distinct remedies, which will effectively have, which would have the effect of merging them or making them equivalent when the statute itself does not have that particular intention in mind. So therefore, as compared to an appeal, the revisional jurisdiction is extremely limited and again pertains primarily to issues which go to the root of the matter in the sense of the jurisdiction of the court concerned. Now, one more aspect which you have to bear in mind, that ultimately this section is not directed against conclusions of law and fact in the sense that jurisdiction is not really involved. But there are certain judgments which have come subsequently where there has been a slight elaboration of this limited scope of interference, and where the courts have read in some form of even a factual determination, provided you are able to demonstrate that there is a gross illegality or a shocking sort of adjudication by the trial court, which would permit the requisite interference by the High Court concerned. But despite this, what I have just mentioned to you, the ultimate effect remains that it is nowhere close to an appeal in terms of the scope or in terms of the ambit which it actually seeks to articulate. Now, as I mentioned, the scope of appeal, review, revision, this is actually enough material for a separate course in itself. So I am rushing through a lot of this because we need to finish this in one session. But like I said, the subject itself is extremely deep, lots of permutations and combinations. All I am trying to bring about today is the fundamental differences between these different avenues. Now, one element more which you can bear in mind is that when it comes to the revisional jurisdiction, there will be certain overlap with one of the constitutional remedies which we will deal with later. So just bear this in mind. And please note the slight overlap between revisional jurisdiction to a certain extent and the power under Article 227 of the Constitution of India. There are obviously differences, but we will quickly come through them when we go to the next phase. Now, so we've dealt with appeal, we've dealt with revision. Now, before I go further in terms of the appellate remedies, which or the challenge remedies or processes available to you, the third avenue which is open to you and which is not an avenue where you go to an appellate forum is the avenue of review. Now, please bear in mind, except for the power of review given to constitutional courts, like the Supreme Court or the High Court, power of review has historically always been recognized once again as a creation of the statute. There is no inherent power of review available with civil courts or tribunals. The only exception is, again, this is again a complex issue, there might be a limited inherent review power when it comes to procedural review. That is elements of violation of natural justice, etc., etc. But when it comes to review on the merits, review has always been recognized purely as a creation of the statute. Now, please bear in mind that a review by its very nature, especially under the CPC, is extremely limited in nature. When you file a review, please bear in mind you are not permitted to re-argue the matter. You are not permitted to bring new material on record. You are restricted to what is the record before the original court. And a review is nothing but asking the same court to revise or review its determination in as much as you believe that the determination is incorrect. Now, the only limited parameter, one of the only limited parameters, there are two or three, but the only effective parameter which is available to you is if you are able to demonstrate an error apparent on the record. Now, an error apparent on the record might seem to be reasonably amorphous or vague for you to be able to pitch in a much larger case, but the explicit understanding by a series of judgments is that review jurisdiction, and when juxtaposed with the phrase error apparent on the record, is to be construed extremely narrowly. So when you say error apparent on the record, you can't tell the court, oh, you read one cross-examination, you didn't read it properly. If you had read 3-4 more questions, you may have interpreted it differently. You can't tell the court that, oh, you didn't, by the way, this argument of mine, you didn't consider properly. This is what I meant. So elements of argument where you are essentially trying to re-argue the matter before the court or the tribunal do not fall within the review jurisdiction. So to give you an example of, say, a very, very limited scope of review, let's say in the case between A and B, the court comes to a finding that B actually admitted in the cross-examination in question number, let's say, 25, B's answer was, yes, I signed this agreement. And hence, I decree the case against B. Now, question 25, the answer to question 25 by B was not that I admit. The answer was, I don't admit. So the trial court, for whatever reason, forgot or overlooked that word don't. and read an admission which never existed. So this is error apparent on the record, because you can show that question and say, this is the answer upon which the entire decision is based. And you are saying that I admitted something, but no, I didn't. Please see, my explicit answer is I don't admit. So this is something which you can say is an error apparent on the record, because when the court sees this, the court knows, yes, that something went wrong. Now, obviously, there are lots of permutations and combinations in terms of what the courts have determined error apparent to be. In certain cases, if there is a gross error in law also, a very gross error in law, for instance, a wrong statute is applied, or even within that statute, a unequivocal position of law is overlooked and a contrary decision is given, you can possibly try and bring it within the review parameter. But again, like I said, these are matters which are much easier to open up in appeal as compared to review. I think the success rate of review petitions is possibly 2 or 3%. I mean, from my limited experience, I don't know, there's an empirical study on this, but I wouldn't pitch it at more than 2 or 3%, because ultimately a judgment is always arrived at after due consideration by the court or tribunal concerned. And then even if you have a difference of opinion, which you legitimately might have, that is something to be articulated in an appellate forum, and usually not before the same forum, unless you fall within the extremely limited parameter of review. Now, also do bear in mind that sometimes it is not logical or not strategically feasible to file a review. For instance, the lower court may have been silent or overlooked a particular aspect of what you said. Now, that is not material enough for you to be able to get the judgment reviewed. But if you place it before the judge then might get an opportunity to deal with your argument. And then the review order, when read along with the original order, will then make your case much harder to postulate before the appellate forum. So in many cases, strategically, it's a good idea not to file a review. Go up in appeal and tell the appellate court, look, this point was never considered by the original judge or the original court. And that obviously will create some prejudice in the appellate forum insofar as why this point was not considered. So strategically also, on many occasions, possibly it's a good idea not to file a review. But in certain circumstances, strategically, it may be imperative. For instance, the original court may not have noted a few submissions made by you. Now, always remember, when you go in appeal, an appellate court may ask you, where did you make this submission? It's never recorded in the judgment. So therefore, for sometimes purely strategic reasons, reviews can be filed to bring on record the fact that, look, I made this argument. I expressly pressed this point, which was not decided. So that at least it comes on the record and you can show the appellate court, look, I am aggrieved by the fact that the order, that the point or the question which I raised has not been considered. I pointed this out specifically to the original court. So therefore, now I am entitled to raise it before you, because this is something which I say I argued. So a review, as I said, again, usually is not a very successful remedy, but it is something which you can take into consideration. Now, very quickly to run through two statute-specific remedies. See, this doesn't require much elaboration. There will be certain remedies of, say, challenge procedure, which will be provided for under particular statutes. To give you one example, you will have, say, Section 34 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Section 34 is nothing but the provision which permits you to try and challenge a particular, let's say, order or proceeding which has been made by a particular original, let's say, the arbitral tribunal. But the scope under Section 34 is very limited. If you read the text of Section 34, you will see it is only restricted, say, to patent illegality. Now, public policy has been whittled down significantly, even more after the 2015 amendment to the Arbitration Act. So a Section 34 paradigm is very, very narrow, does not even come close to a full-fledged appeal. So therefore, under certain statutes, the only challenge remedy available to you will essentially be something which is a very watered down version of an appeal. And this is again based on, different considerations. For instance, under the Arbitration Act, the entire purpose is to ensure that as much as possible, the award should attain finality, it should be respected. Therefore, the scope is very narrow. So again, this depends on the specific statute, what is the kind of considerations which underlie the appellate or challenge mechanism provided for under the statute, etc. Now, the last aspect, constitutional remedies. Now, see, under the constitutional scheme, there are certain rights inherent in litigants in terms of challenge procedure, which cannot be circumscribed by statutes. For instance, whatever the CPC may say, whatever the Arbitration Act may say, ultimately you will always have certain constitutional remedies available to you. One of these main remedies is Article 227 of the Constitution of India. Now, again, this is a very good example of how our judicial interpretation carves out larger avenues for interference by constitutional courts than what may possibly have been contemplated originally when the text of the Constitution was debated upon and approved. So, Article 227, if you read it, is not really an appellate provision or even a challenge provision. Article 227 simply says that the High Court will have superintendence over all courts and inferior tribunals within its jurisdiction. So effectively, it is something which talks about superintendence and which, let's say, reiterates the supremacy of the High Court in the judicial hierarchy of that particular state. But judgments over the years have interpreted Article 227 to mean the availability of an inherent right of hearing challenges to all kinds of orders which may be rendered by inferior courts or tribunals or subordinate courts or tribunals to that particular high court. So what this means is DHOR section 96 of the CPC, which permits very few orders as being appealable. DHOR section 115, which permits very limited categories of revisional cases. Under Article 227, literally every order or judgment which has been passed by a subordinate court or tribunal can effectively be assailed before the High Court. Now, again, bear in mind there are certain restrictions which the courts themselves have brought into play by the different judgments. So, there will be judgments which say that the scope again of Article 227 is limited. The court is not supposed to reappreciate the facts. The court is not supposed to go into a detailed examination of the merits. But primarily, once again, the scope of interference is one where the court finds that there has been some grave illegality or some patent illegality. But once again, these are very subjective terms. So ultimately, Article 227 provides a very wide scope of challenge. The only difference is that if you are entitled to a right of appeal, naturally you would want to take a right of appeal because that is much wider. It gives you a chance to argue everything under the sun. But in a case where you don't have a right of appeal, you don't have a right of revision, Article 227 is a savior, especially if you are effectively trying to challenge any order before the High Court, which has been passed by a subordinate court or by a subordinate forum. Now, this is not strictly constitutional in that sense, but many high courts also. Now, Article 227 is not available to you if you are seeking to impugn an order, say, passed by a single bench of the High Court. Naturally, a single bench's order cannot be impugned before the division bench under Article 227. So, Article 227 only refers in that sense to an inter-court proceeding. But in many high courts in the country, particularly the original high courts, the ones which were set up under British rule, for instance, Bombay or Calcutta or Madras, you will have something called the letters patent. The letters patent is nothing but the originating document which actually, established these high courts. So even today, the underlying rules in terms of what are the powers, etc., within the high court are determined by the letters patent. So in many cases, specifically writ petitions, you will be able to maintain appeals or let's say interlocutory appeals, even though there may be no strict provision for the same, by utilizing the letters patent and filing an appeal before the division bench. Letters patent is something you will routinely see in references, say, to the Bombay, Madras, even Delhi for that matter, wherein that particular document, which is only available qua that particular high court, can be utilized by you to make an appeal before the division bench against an order passed by the single bench. But letters patent usually only applies in the case of writ jurisdiction. It doesn't have any application in the case of, say, a original side litigation before that particular high court, because those are governed by separate original side rules. For instance, in the case of the Delhi High Court. Now, this is as far as the Article 227 jurisdiction and the letters patent in certain high courts is concerned. Also, the specific statute setting up the particular high court itself may provide for certain independent remedies, like in the case of the Delhi High Court. The one other remedy, which is again something which is a matter of significant controversy, is Article 136 of the Constitution of India. Now, see, under various statutes, constitutionally, it is permissible for an appeal in the sense of a stricto sensu wide appeal to be given to the Supreme Court. For instance, if you look at the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Court, there is a right of appeal to the Supreme Court in certain situations. If you look at the Armed Forces Act, the insolvency may not be the perfect example. If you look at the Armed Forces Act, there is actually precedent on this which says that under the Armed Forces Act, if there is an order passed, then the only remedy is to approach the Supreme Court. But please bear in mind the fact that there is a distinct avenue available to approach the Supreme Court against all kinds of orders, and which is provided to you under Article 136 of the Constitution. And 136 also in that sense is very similar to Article 227 in the sense that it was never intended as an appellate forum or as an appellate provision. But 136 is a provision which has increasingly been read over the years or utilized over the years by the Supreme Court to interfere with pretty much every single kind of adjudication possible in our country. So these special leave petitions, which make up the overwhelming majority of litigation before the Supreme Court, are all filed under Article 136. So Article 136 is nothing but an articulation of the power of the Supreme Court to do complete justice in that sense. And again, have superintendence over, let's say, over all courts and tribunals, which obviously are under its jurisdiction in the country. That is what it was originally intended as. But increasingly, once the special leave petition system took over, the vast majority of litigations before the Supreme Court are under Article 136. For instance, under the Arbitration Act, under Section 37, you are allowed one appeal against an order passed under Section 37 rejecting your challenge to the award. So effectively, the Section 37 is the final appeal available to you. There is no further revisional jurisdiction, nothing else. But under Article 136, you can petition the Supreme Court and say, look, there is a grave question of law which actually exists in my case. Therefore, please hear my challenge to the order passed by the appellate court in the exercise of your extraordinary jurisdiction. Now, effectively, 136 was only to be utilized if there was a substantial question of law. But now, if you see in the last maybe 3 decades, the substantial question of law has been interpreted so liberally, it's purely discretionary. So therefore, as far as it comes to special leave petitions, the scope of interference is extremely discretionary, and which is why you have this huge amount of litigation in the Supreme Court, because every party wants to take a chance. And so as a lawyer, this is something you should be aware of, that even in a dead case, there is a remote chance, again, it's a limited chance, that you might be able to succeed in an SLP. Now, in an SLP also, if you talk to advocates on record, the chance of converting the SLP into a successful proceeding is very limited. Possibly the success rate might be 5 to 7% or 10%, but considering it's your last shot, it is a shot which a lot of litigants take, and increasingly so, and which you can see from the manifold increase in the levels of litigation before the Supreme Court in the last 3 decades. There has been a lot of empirical study on this in the sense of the increasing workload of the Supreme Court over the years. Now, just to finish with what I had to say today. So ultimately, this is in a very broad spectrum. Now, today's class is possibly, I think, the most brief or the most inadequate in terms of being able to tell you the complexity or the different avenues which are available to you. but again, we have time constraints. But please bear in mind, as I mentioned to you, that when you go in appeal also, this is something which you require serious thought about. You will be surprised at the number of cases where appeals or revisions or other challenge remedies are invoked, and the forum which is approached actually comes to a conclusion that this is not really maintainable. You'll be surprised at the number of times where appeals or appellate procedures have been held to be non-maintainable. Sometimes, of course, they are strategic, just want to do it for the heck of it, but in large variety of cases, this causes significant loss and injury to the client without any purpose being served at all. Now, also bear in mind that one last comment, when I talked about appeals under statutes, some statutes will also provide for limited second appeals also formally. So under the CPC, there is a provision for a second appeal also, but that is even more limited, because under a first appeal, you are entitled to raise everything. But under the CPC, you have a right of second appeal, but that is extremely narrow. There, only if the second appeal court comes to a finding that a substantial question of law is involved, proceeds to frame that substantial question of law, and then comes to the determination that the courts below completely failed in properly appreciating that substantial question of law, would then interference be justified. So again, as I mentioned, various permutations and combinations, but the ultimate message which I want to send across today is, please be extremely conscious about the fact that not only is the merits of an appeal important in the sense of how you articulate the case before an appellate forum, and where again you will follow a lot of the parameters we discussed in terms of the drafting, how it is to be drafted, how it is to be argued, etc. The only difference now being you actually have an impugned order based on which to attack it and then postulate your case, as opposed to an original pleading where you don't have an impugned order in the strict sense. So therefore, this is as far as appeals, revisions, etc., challenge mechanisms are concerned. And basically, this is what you need to resort to if your first attempt in terms of the original adjudication ends in failure. So that's it as far as the element of appeals, etc., are concerned. If there are any queries or questions, yeah, please feel free. So if you will be typing this out in the meantime, in the next session now in the next session, we'll be presuming a case where either the entirety of the appellate or revisional proceedings are exhausted, and then how do you, once you've gotten the benefit of an order or a decree, proceed to try and enforce it. That's how we will be dealing with the next session. So if there are no queries, then we can probably meet up again on Sunday as scheduled. Right. All right. So I think we can call it a day today. I'll see you guys on Sunday morning. Bye-bye.